There's another question about myth and numbness,
Hmm.
and I want to ask this because it's one of my favorite Aristotelian portrayals of the main drive behind fallacies. I want to go back to that momentarily to say, he says, the whole idea behind fallacies is to show the morally or factually weaker cause as the better one. And this is the main objective of why we use fallacies and myths. I also wonder if this add on to this definition, especially in light of why he studied them, because smears were also in Greece and unfair trials were there at that time. It can be the following: that myths are also created to numb the hearer from the need to hear the other non-fallacious accounts. One of the ways of creating this numbness is to smear the debunker of myths and fallacies. This numbness plays a big part in becoming apathetic when myths become foundations of injustice and mass suffering on the ground. There's a discussion on myths and taxonomies challenged and taxonomies engendered. In your work and in tackling life colonialism, one of the major things that happens is that taxonomies and labels, for lack of a better word, get examined and challenged. So they, challenging the people who have been called terrorists, savages, illiterates, and the notion of empty land. These are all challenging these names. And oftentimes, as a result of these efforts to debunk myths, labels get mirrored back to the creator of the myths. Interestingly, and as a result of challenging misanthropic taxonomies, savage, uncivilized, inferior, religiously fanatic, etc., ethical taxonomies surface. I spoke about Terra Nullius, and the way you lay out the inner mechanics of Hamas in the book, being the extremist, fanatical extremist, is an example of debunking a myth of misanthropic taxonomies. I put myself in the shoes of peoples, groups, and political parties that are having a very smooth ride on this international milieu by relying on these taxonomies. The one in front of me is a savage, a danger to civilized world. Killing them is inevitable. And I can see how it becomes a pretty dangerous academic scholarly practice to remind them otherwise, right? But at the same time, I also saw during the past year that the taxonomies you challenged actually made their way into the International Court of Justice. So, using the taxonomies you challenged by risking your livelihood, you talked about incremental genocide, you talked about the Amalek there, and these were all the things that actually made it towards the ICJ. Tell us a little bit about the downsides, and also that I want to know the upsides of being a debunker of myth.
Okay. Yeah. To round up your question together, if I may, I kind of fuse them together into one issue, which I think is something that is missing maybe from our discussion.
Mhm.
And this is that the very act of settler colonialism is a violent, at the very beginning, is a violent act. If you come pretending, or maybe genuinely, originally, thinking that you are saving yourself, so
Mhm.
you are a survivor, and yet you come with an ideology that you're not a survivor, actually, you are a redeemer, then it's the first act of violence that ignites a cycle of violence. Now, the more exposed you are in your genuine wish to dispossess an indigenous people, the more violent you are in the attempt to do this, because it becomes impractical, it becomes invalid, in the eyes of many, it becomes immoral. So you're not achieving as much of, or you're not obtaining as much of the new land as possible with as few of the indigenous people on it as possible through discussions, through kind of voluntary willingness of the local population to leave or destroy themselves. So you need more and more violence, but there is a counter violence to your violence. And the counter violence justifies more violence on your side. I mean, the cycle, we know how the cycle works. So we are ending third generation later with young Israelis who do have memories of Palestinian violence. It's not that if people tell them that there's violence perpetrated by Palestinians, it's an imagined violence. It's not an imagined violence. It's real violence. Now, what they're not being told is about the origin of the violence. So it's so interesting to watch it in a way that the colonizer always talks about the symptoms of the violence, and especially the last symptoms, as the issue, but never talks about the origin of the violence. And the colonized always say, well, let's begin with the origin so that we can understand, because we too feel that our own violence is destructive, also to us, not just to you. But what can we do? I mean, you don't leave us any other option. And I think that's the kind of discussion that so interestingly, for the first time, we had a
Yeah.
state that wanted to censor our right to talk about the origin of a violence. It's almost like you're going to a hospital and you're going to a patient, and there's a new rule from the hospital management. We're not going to talk about why people are ill or what is the origin of the disease. We're only allowed to treat the symptoms. And that's I think where we are. And this is so important to understand it. And I think it gives you a moral context to the discussion. You can easily condemn also acts of the colonizers, colonized as well, if you feel the need to do this, if you want to use it international law or whatever. But you don't lose the context. And if you don't lose the context, you are, to my mind, you are building a solid moral as well as political and philosophical even position on the current exchange of violence that you see on the ground. And the imbalance between the genocide that is happening and the acts of guerrilla, or call it even acts of terrorism, is part of the story. The imbalance is not incidental. The imbalance is organic to the issue that we were talking.
Yeah.